So here we are with Yannis Hamilakis, professor of Brown University, and we will start from an old book from you, which is Archaeology and Capitalism. It's now 13 years old, if I well remember, 2007, yeah. Where there you addressed the complex relationship between archaeology and neoliberalism. In the introduction, you was up strong concepts about the gradual depoliticization of ethical debates in archaeology, increasingly focused on interpretative issues having to do with the past, not the present. So the book, as I said, it was first published in 2007. Have you been able to reverse the trend, or do you think it's still true?
Thank you, Alessandro, and I'm very glad to be with you today. Let's go back a little bit and talk about the moment on which that book was published. So 2007, it was prepared and written a few years earlier. It was based on a session at the WAC conference, World Archaeology Congress, in Washington, D.C. So I'm saying all these things because the moment is of essence here. It was published, it was prepared, presented and prepared the year after the US-led invasion in Iraq. And one of the key issues at that moment and at the WAC conference in Washington, D.C. was the archaeologist involvement in that invasion as advisors to various militaries, especially the US military and the UK military. So I had seen, some of my colleagues had seen a very strange phenomenon. We had seen the movement that had actually risen, the anti-war movements, expressing the strong opposition to the war. And at the same time, we were seeing some of our colleagues aligning themselves with the military in some way on the grounds that they wanted to protect antiquities. So they would provide advice to the various authorities and the militaries, provide lists, the so-called no-hit lists, for things to be spared when obviously a country like Iraq was carpet bombed by the US military and the other countries. And for me, that was a huge ethical and political issue to debate. That's why in 2003, I had published an article called subtitle, An Ethical Crisis in Archaeology, using the Iraq case as a case study. My point was that you cannot continue debating the various ethical codes and the various kind of procedures that we have to follow, and yet at the same time, on an issue of such a major importance for the world, do not question your own positionality vis-a-vis such world authorities or imperial powers like the US, or an illicit, illegal war invasion, as was at the beginning at least, the Iraq war. So that was the background, that was the impetus for some of us to actually address the broader issue and say that, hey, we are actually finding ourselves in a situation of bureaucratization, thinking about ethics in a procedural way, but not thinking about the political dimension of our own work, our own involvement with structures of power. At the same time, we're seeing our colleagues being very keen to adopt ethical codes in various associations like yours and others. Yeah. And that discussion was interesting and worthwhile because you were confronted with issues of ethical conduct, but we were extremely concerned and worried that we had seen a split, a divide between the ethical and the political. So the main argument of the book was to reconnect the ethical and the political. My concept of the book in the introduction was the political ethic, in the sense to say that you cannot separate the two. You cannot think ethics in the abstract. You cannot divorce the ethical discussion from the political context of the moment and on who is benefiting in every time from the work of the archaeologists and the involvement of archaeologists in the various apparatuses of power. Another issue that actually concerned us a lot at that moment was the issue of so-called contract archaeology or CRM archaeology, something that I'm sure you know very well yourself. And the attitude by many of our colleagues to see that as another unproblematic sector of archaeology, whereas we were saying, hey, let's consider our own position vis-a-vis the neoliberal mechanisms of the market and how very often the archaeologists working in those sectors provide an alibi, provide a green alibi for the remaking of whole landscapes, for destruction of environments, for the reorganization of space and of human life along the lines of the market in a very unregulated neoliberal sense. So these two kind of phenomena for us were instrumental in gathering a group of people around us and discussing how we can actually revitalize the discussion about politics and archaeology and insist that politicization in that sense, in the sense of being reflexive and critical, needs to be an important facet and important parameter in the discussion. As to your direct question, whether we have succeeded or not, I believe we have to some extent, and that's not so much because of our intervention, although I do think that our book and our discussion helped a lot, and also other books by other colleagues that followed, of course, we are not the only ones, but also because of movements, because of what's happening in the world. Look around us now, look around at the various movements around the world, look around at the movements, let's say, the one I know fairly well because I work in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, that actually again inserts a kind of a very important element in the discussion about contemporary society, and that's the question of colonialism and of race. So social movements, political developments, the rise of the extreme right and neo-fascism and neo-Nazism in Europe is another political development that actually confronts archaeologists with their own responsibilities. So I would say that our critique helped in repoliticizing archaeology, but developments, both developments from the right, like the rise of the extreme right, and from the movements, from the left and the movements, actually helped move archaeology more to the political terrain. And now I think it's almost impossible for any archaeologist, contemporary archaeologist, to deny the political role of archaeology and to maintain that they can actually continue working in their own bubble, in their own little world, with making no reference to what's happening in the world and what's happening to the political and social developments in our lives and in our world. So I would say that I am optimistic. I would say that maybe, I mean, there is still a lot to do, of course. There is still, there are so many fronts on which we need to be active and be, to confront the various situations. But I would say that we're now in a much more, in a much better position to discuss, at least, to discuss openly the political dimension of archaeology than the way we were when we were writing this book.
Yeah. And so we come to the second question, which obviously is on the line of the first. One of your major line of research seeks to apply the archaeological analytical process to interpret the present. From this, there stems your commitment to current issues such as the tragic condition of the refugees detained in the Moria camp in Lesbos and the danger of those atrocities becoming a new normal. What role do you think archaeologists should or could play in the present? That's obviously the continuous line of the first line.
I mean, you can now, I think you can understand how an issue like contemporary migration was important for me, especially since 2015, when Europe woke up to the phenomenon, partly because of the Syrian exodus, partly because the phenomenon became visible for the mainstream media and for Europeans as a whole. That phenomenon actually caused many people to rethink and consider many issues to do with European identity and with European policies. I talked about Black Lives Matter before. For me, contemporary migration is another phenomenon where colonialism makes itself present, where these people are telling us that, look, you think that we live in a post-colonial world? No, colonialism is still present, and we still live with the consequences of colonialism. Many of the people who actually are entering Europe now come from previous European colonies or from areas that have been affected by recent colonial wars, like the so-called war on terror. So there is that dimension, which is very, very important. For me also, the whole issue of national identity has been one of my, the key kind of issues in my own research. And borders are to do also with ideas about national identity. So in relation to Greece, I wanted to see how conceptions of nationhood in Greece relate to phenomena of contemporary migration, how what we call now bordering practices relate to both constitution of the nation, but also to the whole project of Europe as Fortress Europe, as a kind of an entity that proclaims itself to be the cradle of civilization, and at the same time an entity that needs to protect itself by policing the border, by not allowing people who are fleeing persecution or war to enter its own territory. As for what archaeology can do, as you know, contemporary archaeology has been a very recent and a very dynamic subfield of archaeology. An archaeology that says that we archaeologists can interrogate the present, the contemporary world, through our own skills, through our own methods, and make the present less familiar in many ways, but at the same time examine its materiality. As you know, archaeology is about materiality and temporality, and the interplay, the intersection between the two. So for me, a phenomenon like migration is a phenomenon that can actually be explored very profitably by adopting archaeological lenses and the archaeological optics and archaeological ways of relating to matter and to time. And I'm not saying profitably in the sense of extraction or exploitation or opportunism. I'm saying it in the sense of a successful attempt to actually intervene in a phenomenon that has not been explored from the material point of view or the historical point of view so much. So if you look at the professionals who actually look at the phenomenon, they are social anthropologists very often, they are political scientists, they are specialists in migration studies or geopolitics. We, in fact, can be witnesses not only to the brutality of the border regime, which is very, very important, but also to the material dimensions of the phenomenon, and explore not only what material traces the border crossing phenomenon leaves, but also how the apparatus of nation state and of Fortress Europe, the apparatus of the border, constructs its own materiality. So when I work on Lesbos, at Moria and other contexts on Lesbos, I don't only record or reflect or think about what material traces border crossers leave, but also I'm studying what new materialities that regime of the border creates. So for me, a detention center or a refugee camp or an asylum service installation is equally worth investigating. So I'm also turning the lens and the camera and the lights to the apparatus itself, to the border regime and to the state and to the European Union, not just to people. And with people, with border crossers, I'm trying to have a relationship of collaboration and alliance and solidarity. So I see this as an activist project as much as a scholarly project, and the people who I'm talking to, border crossers in particular, are actually allies, and very often the activist dimension takes priority over the scholarly dimension or the dimension of recording things. In terms of what else can we contribute? I've already mentioned the emphasis on materiality and the recording of materiality. I also mentioned the concept of witnessing, that we can also become witnesses to what's happening there, and very often to the brutality of the border. But there is also the aspect of affectivity and of memory and at the archive. So by affectivity, I mean that some of the remnants of migration have immense affective value, can actually touch people, can actually make people understand the phenomenon much better than an abstract narrative or a story as being told by a political scientist or even a social anthropologist. So I'm calling for the mobilization of the affective import and power of the object, and that certain objects can actually produce a space of witnessing and a space of understanding and of solidarity between, let's say, a border crosser from Iraq or Afghanistan and a European citizen in Rome or Athens, or even an American citizen in Providence, where I work, or New York. And finally, I believe that we archaeologists need to collect selectively some of the remnants of migration, as it happens today, for archival and mnemonic reasons. There needs to be a material record of that beyond the narrative, again, beyond the written versions. There needs to be a collection of things that will speak to this specific moment, not only in terms of what these people are suffering very often, but also on what they achieve. So I collect selectively from Lesbos things that are to do not only with the brutality of the border and the tragedy of border crossing very often, but also with the achievements of border crossers as social agents. Let's say the objects they create, the recycling they are involved in, the upcycling, the production of crafts and objects that come from life vests or other materials, or the paintings they paint while they are stuck in a detention center or in a camp. All these things are important material signifiers of a moment that speak of both the brutality of a regime, but at the same time, the resilience and the power of border crossers as agents of their own life. I hope that was...
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So we come to the third and last question. Much of your work focuses on the instrumentalization of archaeological narratives to build national identity. So you just said. And Greece features often as an exemplary case study. This conference is held in Italy, where we share the same rhetoric about classical past, used as a national unifying tool. This is the paradox of our sector. Archaeologists receive acknowledgement mostly when their function and freedom are instrumental to a collective national or local narrative. Do you think it is possible to find a mediation between these two dimensions?
That's a very interesting question. It's something that obviously, it's not an easy one, and it's something that concerns me a lot, and I'm thinking a lot about. I've been thinking a lot about it in recent years. My short answer is that, yes, I do believe that there's a way out. I do believe that there's a way of continuing, let's say, working on things like classical heritage of Greece, and at the same time be critical of it and not allow yourself to be co-opted by the narrative of the nation or the narrative of a crypto-colonial country, like in the case of Greece. Now, you may know that I excavate early sites like Neolithic sites in Greece. So I do not work on the classical period as somebody who studies classical material to publish as a classical archaeologist. I'm the classical archaeologist. But I work on the classical as a phenomenon because of its key role in the constitution of the identity of Greece and the identity of the European so-called civilization as a whole. I know that many of my colleagues worry, especially my classical archaeology colleagues, worry that if we critique too much that phenomenon, we lose our symbolic capital. We lose the authority that the classical as a archetypal moment in the originary kind of narratives about civilization has in Western imagination. And my response to them is that, you can still maintain part of that capital if you explain why this phenomenon has become so important for the West. In other words, your historicization of the phenomenon, your implicit critique of it can be as important as the actual kind of study of things themselves. So I'm saying that there are people, and things change also in European societies as well as in world societies today. So people would be very interested to know why, how come that a specific moment in time in the Mediterranean became so important for the European imagination. Yeah. So to turn this round and study it as a phenomenon for reflection and critique and understanding, as opposed to just produce admiring unproblematic narratives about how great these things were, how great the Greeks and the Romans were. And as I said, I believe that we should see our work in relation to this in conjunction with recent developments in the European societies and other societies around the world. Again, I'm returning to Black Lives Matter because it is the movement of the moment. And one of the things that these movements have actually done is to actually make us reflect more on questions about race. Something that most of us, even people like me who have studied nationalism in archaeology a lot, have actually not confronted head-on to the extent that it actually needs to be confronted. So I'm now rethinking many of my own ideas and thinking in relation to nationalism. I still believe that a lot of what I've said still holds, but I believe that I needed to do, and now I'm doing, I hope, more work on the racialized dimensions of the nation form and the nation project in relation to classical antiquity as well. And I think we can actually ally ourselves with our colleagues in classics, non-archaeologists, like specialists on philology or on history, who are doing a lot right now in reflecting on the racial dimensions of the classical phenomenon. Yeah, and through that kind of alignments between ourselves, other colleagues in other fields that are actually exploring similar questions, and the broader social movements, we can manage to be both topical and kind of speak to the present, but at the same time reflect seriously, deeply and academically on the phenomenon itself.
Perfect. Thank you very much.